Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. If democracy begins in conversation, then we need to nurture a culture where ordinary people like us routinely talk about those things that help us understand each other, whether it's about climate, race, religion, gender, or politics. When we're trying to make sense of our city and the world we live in, every question comes with a set of assumptions about the nature of ourselves and our place in a larger world. The Conversation Lab provides a safe place to talk about some of those things. This program is produced by CFRO-FM in Vancouver. It's available on air and online on various platforms, and we appreciate the help of Vancouver's community groups. Dr. Michelle Sholzberg is a clinical hematologist and the medical director of the Coagulation Laboratory at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. She's also the co-director of the Hematology Oncology Clinical Research Group and the Hematology Immunology Translational Research Theme. I met Michelle working on a podcast called Pillar of Hope, and she's the team leader of what's been called the Rapid COVID Coag Study. Pillar of Hope explores the use of a common drug that can decrease COVID-19 complications, and this podcast chronicles that study. I wanted to circle back and have a one-on-one conversation with Michelle, so thanks to Zoom, we're able to join her at home in Toronto. You know, one of the questions I asked you when we first met was, why'd you become a doctor?
So I became a doctor because I knew that I wanted to help people. I became interested in science and in medicine. Sorry, let me just deal with the dog. He's 14 going on 15.
No problem.
Just give me 1 second. I cannot promise that he won't start barking again very soon. Okay, so I became a doctor because I suppose I've always known that I wanted to help people. And I became interested in science and in medicine in high school when we first dissected a fetal pig. But I suppose that the desire to want to help and the desire to want to connect with people is something that's very much a part of who I am. And it's just sort of part of my core values and the way that my mind and I guess my heart naturally works. Became interested in science and in medicine in high school, but it took me many years before I had the confidence to apply to medical school. In fact, I applied to dental school and completed 3/4 of a dentistry degree before my mother became ill. And I realized at that time that what I really wanted to do was to pursue a career in medicine. And so I dropped out from dentistry and I reapplied to medicine. And thankfully my mother is well now, but that was a really big moment for me because it was when I decided that life is too short and that I needed to take a chance, even if I was met with failure. And so that was a time in my life where I think matured substantially because I realized that taking a risk, even when you fail, is worth it. And so from then on, I pursued medicine.
So I'm curious, was your mother surprised that you chose medicine?
I don't think so. I think that I'd always talked about wanting to be a physician. And I think that the way that I had sort of mentally worked through the process is that I thought that maybe I just wasn't strong enough, or maybe it would just be too hard for me to deal with death and dying on a regular basis. And I thought, going into dentistry will still allow me to be a healthcare professional, but I won't have to be affronted with that on a regular basis. And dentistry is an amazing career, but it just wasn't for me. She wasn't surprised. Nobody in my family was surprised.
Can you talk a bit about the work you do now?
Sure. So I'm a hematologist. So I'm a blood specialist, and hematology is a subspecialty of internal medicine. And an internist is sort of thought of as the doctor's doctor. So it's the physician that other physicians consult when they're stumped by a complex medical problem. And so then there are a bunch of subspecialties that branch off of that, and hematology is one of them. So I'm the division head of hematology oncology at St. Michael's Hospital. And I'm also a scientist, an associate scientist at Lee Cushing Knowledge Institute and affiliated with the University of Toronto. And I also run the coagulation laboratory at St. Michael's Hospital, part of the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathobiology. My work focuses on bleeding and clotting, other common blood conditions. that are very prevalent and affect a lot of people. And so what's really exciting is that my scientific work is directly inspired by my clinical work. And so I focus very heavily on disorders that are associated with issues pertaining to health equity. So for example, one of the areas that I focus on is on iron deficiency anemia and how it affects women. And that's something that I really hope to tackle over the course of my career, but it'll probably take a decade or so.
I read an article about Iron Mom.
Yeah.
Is your new nickname?
Yeah. So the Iron Mom is the name of a study that we developed. And so the Iron Mom is a project that I developed with some wonderful colleagues. And my co-principal investigator is Dr. Andrea Lausman, who's a high-risk obstetrician at St. Michael's Hospital. And we decided that very high percentage of women who are pregnant have iron deficiency anemia. And this is something that we can absolutely fix and tackle. And why aren't we doing something about it? So we put together a program that focuses on empowering the patient and facilitating diagnosis and management for obstetricians and other obstetrical healthcare providers. And so now that we've applied to the CIHR for a grant to launch this as a randomized controlled trial to see if this website and app that we developed will actually work outside of the confines of our hospital. And so then because of that, some of my colleagues have called me the Iron Mom.
When we first met, you were working on a project called the Rapid COVID Coag trials. And I struggled initially to try and understand the relationship between blood and COVID. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I don't think that I thought once it was clear that the pandemic was making its way through the world, I don't think that I thought initially that I was going to become a COVID researcher. But then once it became clear that the infection itself is associated with an increased risk of blood clots, that's when I realized that I could help. And I realized that I could help because I've devoted my clinical and research career to bleeding and clotting problems. And also because my research training is specifically in clinical trial development, which is the highest form of scientific evidence that we can develop. And so when I knew that patients seemed to be at higher risk for blood clot, and when we really didn't know how to manage patients with COVID at all, there were some early reports that indicated that giving patients an injection of a blood thinner, which we commonly give to patients when they're admitted to hospital, seemed to be associated with a lower risk of death amongst these patients. And so the question in my mind and the question in other people's minds as well is, well, what if we intensify the dose of the blood thinner that we give? Maybe if we gave more, patients would be even more protected. And so that's what this trial is about. It's comparing lower standard dose heparin, which is one of the most commonly used blood thinners in the world, the most commonly used blood thinner in hospital setting, to higher dose heparin. And we're looking to see if that decreases the risk of poor outcomes amongst these patients when they're admitted to hospital with COVID, and that includes the risk of death.
So I want to back up just a little bit and go back to the beginning. When did COVID enter your consciousness?
Probably microbiologists were aware of COVID much sooner than the rest of the medical world, but it became clear in January that what was originally something that was localized to Wuhan, China, was now spreading at a very rapid pace, and it was making its way to Europe. And by February, it became clear that it was we were now dealing with a global pandemic, and that it was going to come to Canada. And at that time, we knew very little about COVID. We knew little about how it was transmitted, how to decrease the risk of transmission, how to treat patients effectively, what would help them, what could potentially harm them, what are the appropriate indicators to admit somebody to hospital, and what are the indicators to send somebody home. We also didn't know if we had enough personal protective equipment. And so we were concerned at that time about how to protect ourselves as healthcare workers, but also concerned about our families when we came home and wanted to make sure that we wouldn't bring it home as well.
I'm curious, what's changed for you in terms of how you teach, how you work, how you come home?
A lot has changed. So throughout my regular work day, and I don't regularly at this time work with patients who have confirmed COVID, That said, I do take care of patients in general, and we're unfortunately in a situation right now where we have to assume that everybody is infected, including our coworkers. But I now wear personal protective equipment throughout all of my interactions with all of my patients. I also wear a mask whenever I'm speaking with any of my coworkers and colleagues. When I am evaluating a patient with COVID, we up the ante in terms of how much personal protective equipment we wear and the protocol that we follow when we go in and come out of the room. And so for those patients, we're wearing N95 masks, which is what we use to protect us from airborne infections. We also gown and glove and follow very strict protocol for the donning and doffing. Donning and doffing is just a medical term for putting the personal protective equipment on and then taking it off. And you have to do that very carefully and properly, otherwise you can infect yourself. And so whenever I am being exposed to patients who do have COVID and I'm slotted to work on the COVID wards in January, I'm very cautious when I come home. I change my clothes before I enter my home. So I get changed in the garage. My shoes are left in the garage. If I've evaluated patients with COVID that day, I go straight into the shower before embracing my family. But at the beginning of all of this, we didn't even know if it was safe to embrace our families. And there are some healthcare providers who are uncomfortable being in close quarters with their families because the risk is there. And so some people stay in hotels or stay in their basements or stayed in tents in their garages. There are lots of photos like that on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. It's a big sacrifice, and I absolutely do not mean to imply that I'm one of the individuals who've made the biggest sacrifice. I think the people who've made the biggest sacrifices are those who are on the very front lines, meaning intubating patients, evaluating patients when we really did not know what the right thing to do was. Of course, I was evaluating patients who have blood conditions, but there's a distinction between being, an emergency physician or an ICU physician or an ICU nurse or an emergency room nurse or an environmental services worker who has to go in and clean the room of a patient who has COVID in those early days. So those are the people, in my mind, who are the heroes because they didn't necessarily know what the risks were, but they did their job no matter what.
I'm speaking with Dr. Michelle Sholzberg, who's a clinical hematologist, and we're talking about the rapid COVID Coag study. I know the answer to some of these questions because I was able to work on your podcast. Can you talk to Pillar of Hope, or can you talk to the study and how it came together?
So in February, when it became clear that the pandemic was on its way to Canada, and when it also became clear that there was an increased risk of blood clotting, I put together a proposal to compare low dose, which is the regular dose of heparin that we provide to patients who are admitted to hospital with any medical condition, to a higher dose, which we call therapeutic dose heparin, to fully anticoagulate or thin somebody's blood. I was interested to know if that would decrease the risk of poor outcomes, not just decrease the risk of developing blood clots, which is obviously something that we're interested in, but really to know, does this decrease the chances of somebody being admitted to the ICU? Does it decrease the chances of them being intubated? Does it decrease the chances of them dying? Because there seemed to be this signal that this strong stimulus towards blood clotting was implicated in the severity of illness and implicated in the risk of death amongst patients with COVID. So it just became very clear to me, some of it very conscious, some of it subconscious, that I really needed to do something, that I wanted to do something. And so I reached out at that time to Dr. Peter Uni, who is a research mentor of mine. I've worked with him, collaborated with him on previous clinical trials. And I mentioned my idea, and he was very supportive of it and asked if he could be my co-principal investigator, which was a really big deal for me because it's a really big stamp of approval when a senior scientist sort of validates the clinical trial concept of a more junior investigator. So once Peter really validated the importance of the clinical trial for me and told me that I had his full support, I knew that this clinical trial could then become a reality. And so we applied for some research funding through the University of Toronto. And during that time, while I was applying for funding, I started to